Color, It's All Relative, Part 6, Photoshop Layer Blends. You're likely tired of hearing me say that color can be separated into three components: hue, saturation, and lightness. The fact that color can, in theory, be separated into hue, saturation, and lightness doesn't mean that manipulating color in a photograph is quite so tidy. Most photographers manipulate the pixels in a photograph using the RGB color model. That's a convenient model for computers that goes way back to the days of cathode ray tubes. It's less than ideal when we want to adjust hue, or saturation, or lightness in isolation. Neither is CMYK all that helpful when we want to adjust hue, saturation, or lightness in isolation. The black channel is not there to completely separate hue and saturation from lightness. HSL and its close cousin HSV do the most complete job of isolating hue and saturation from lightness. But that's a color model typically available in painting and illustration programs, not photo editing tools like Photoshop and Photoshop Elements. Here we have a simulation of a Macbeth color checker card. This is a familiar test target for studio photographers. It's used when precise color reproduction is required. Here the color patches are RGB simulations in the RGB color space. TLR benefactors have access to this version and a lab version to experiment. We can see that 4 Photoshop color sampler points have been added. As I make adjustments on the hue saturation dialog in Photoshop, we'll be able to see changes in hue, saturation, and brightness. Here's the info palette for those 4 color patches. Photoshop is inconsistent about HSL and HSB. The dialog we typically use to make adjustments to hue, saturation, and lightness is called hue saturation. It includes a lightness slider. The info palette doesn't. The option we get instead is hue, saturation, and brightness. It's no wonder at all why photographers get confused about lightness, brightness, and value. Not even Photoshop is consistent in their usage. Let's begin our exploration with a change in hue. We'll shift hue by 60 degrees clockwise, and we'll leave saturation equal to 0 and lightness equal to 0. That way our intended hue shift will be in isolation. Here's what happens to the simulated Macbeth color checker card when we make that 60-degree clockwise shift in hue. The original is on the left, and the adjusted version is on the right. You might not be able to tell, but the only significant change is in the hues for the color patches. Their saturation and their lightness, indeed, remain unchanged. We were able to change hue in isolation, even in RGB. Here's the info palette again. We can see the pixel values before and after the adjustment is applied. The saturation and brightness values for the 4 highly saturated patches are unaffected by a sweeping change in hue. What about a small to moderate change in saturation? Say a boost of +10, keeping the change for hue equal to 0 and lightness equal to 0. Again, the original is on the left, the adjusted version on the right. You might not be able to tell, but the only significant change is not just to the saturation levels for those color patches. Their brightness values are also shifting. Although we intended our saturation adjustment to be made in isolation, it wasn't. Back to the info palette, hue is unaffected, but our change to saturation level affected not only saturation values, it also affected brightness values as well. We can see this even more prominently with a large saturation boost. In this case, +45 made the red patch hit 100% saturation. So let's see the effect of a +45 boost to saturation. It's very obvious that more than the level of saturation is changing here. Significant changes occur not just for the level of saturation, but also for brightness and even a tiny shift in hue in the yellow patch. Our saturation adjustment was definitely not done in isolation. Let's go take a look and see what happens when we boost lightness. It's apparent that lightness increased, but what happened to the saturation levels? As the brightness levels for our patches increased, their saturation levels decreased. With this episode, we begin to focus on the practical implications of color theory for our digital photographs. When we use adjustment layers or we apply changes to a pixel-based layer in a tool like Photoshop, we can use layer blend modes. We can use layer blend modes to control how changes in hue, saturation, and lightness affect our photographs. There are 4 layer blend modes that can be helpful when we make adjustments to color or tone: hue, saturation, color, and luminosity. In theory, or more accurately according to the Photoshop help system, these layer blend modes isolate changes in pixel values. Select a saturation layer blend, and Photoshop is supposed to ensure that the resulting color has the new saturation value and the hue and luminosity values of the original color. Does it work that way in practice? Not quite. Here, a saturation boost has been applied. brightness is still boosted as a result of the saturation increase. The saturation layer blend mode help. Here's the info palette values for the patches in the upper right corner. Those are the patches that are more typical of photographs. The increase in brightness levels are less extreme when a saturation blend is used, but clearly more than just saturation changed. Brightness changed as well. In one case, the patch representing sky, the color was more saturated and brighter when a saturation layer blend was applied. In other words, the saturation blend actually made that patch worse. If you've read Photoshop Lab Color, the Canon Conundrum, and other adventures in the most powerful color space, you've probably already concluded, yes, definitely, you can isolate adjustments to color and tone in LAB. Well, don't rush out and buy the full version of Photoshop just yet so you can work in LAB mode. Join me for the next episode, and we'll see that adjustments to color and tone are not as well isolated in LAB as its mavens might lead us to believe. I'm Glenn Mitchell from the Lights Right Studio. Cheers.